Okay, people are joining. Let me wait still a minute so that people get access. Okay. Right. I think most people could join. I see a lot of participants. I'm very glad that that I can open our webinar, today's webinar on End of the Road for EU Cooperation with Eurasian Economic Union, ? I'm very glad that we, the Hubert Foundation in Russia, can do this jointly with SAPS in Brussels and with our Vienna office. Our organization is a German political NGO. We're working in Russia already over 30 years to improve dialogue and find approaches for more and more intense cooperation. We nevertheless choose a slightly negative sounding headline for the webinar because frankly, that's what we hear all the time. So how can you think about future further cooperation after all what has been over the last years? And I think I don't need to repeat all the incidents we had in the last years. Regarding the Eurasian Economic Union, we quite often hear these remarks. It's a geopolitical tool of Russia, and you can't really be interested in supporting this idea. And of course, you can find arguments for it. And yes, it's quite difficult to imagine right now a prosperous economic relationship between these two economic blocks. But the thing is, if you don't start thinking about the possible cooperation or possible cooperations, you will never have a chance to really see them come to life. We need to think about these possible positive relations and developments to make it clear for us and for Russia what would be possible if we can somehow arrange a mutual satisfying relationship. And maybe we are even developing in the course or seeing in the course some new ways or things we haven't seen before or to be able to cooperate already now. First step on doing this exercise is to acknowledge what is already there. That was our intention with the publication on the state of the Eurasian Economic Union, to get a clear view, an objective view, what has so far developed, what hasn't yet realized, and to look a little bit more neutral on this case. I'm very happy that one of the two authors is with us today to talk about this state of the Eurasian Economic Union. I'm very much looking forward to this discussion. I thank very much SEPS for co-hosting us, for cooperating and hosting us today. And I hope we can today look a little bit objectively on what is there and maybe see possibilities for a more cooperative future. So with this, I hand over to Stephen Blockmans. I'm very grateful for everyone is here. Many thanks, and have an interesting discussion.
Thank you very much, Pierre. Also from my side and from the side of SEPS, a big welcome from Brussels, Vienna, Moscow, Minsk. And thank you to the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung for reaching out to SEPS yet again for this particular event. SEPS has been working on, relations between the European Union and the Eurasian Economic Union since the start of the EU process, integration process. In fact, published a report early on commissioned by the budding Eurasian Economic Commission at the time, in which we looked at some of the structural obstacles to the creation of the Eurasian Economic Union, both political, economic, infrastructural, and compare that to the early days of the European Economic Community integration process. Already then, back in 2013, 2014, it was clear that it would take time, just as it would in Western Europe, where distances are smaller and perhaps urban and industrial areas closer to one another, that it would take time in such an expansive landmass as that of the Eurasian Economic Union to forge closer relations within, and then, of course, reach out. Now we've seen, as you mentioned, Pierre, that developments since 2014 in Russia, in the EU, in the shared and contested neighborhood, of course, Ukraine primarily, and recent developments that they've sown doubts on plans of those working in both organizations towards a normalization of relations. And I think in the short run, indeed, confrontational attitudes are likely to determine the relations between the EU and the most important of the EU member states, Russia. In the long term, I agree with you, and Macron, President Macron, of course, is on a mission in this particular respect on finding ways to avoid confrontation, which is deemed essential. And the question then is whether forms of economic cooperation, also involving the other members of the Eurasian Economic Union, such as Belarus, currently, of course, in deep turmoil, internal turmoil, whether they provide the path of least resistance in the mid to longer term. And so the aim of this webinar is really to explore the potential for cooperation between the Eurasian Economic Union and the EU. And we're fortunate to count among our panelists some distinguished experts in these fields, and I would like to welcome them already now. Alexandra Dines from FES Vienna, who will also introduce the report that has been produced under her auspices in just a second. Then Tatiana Isachenko at MGIMO in Moscow, who will talk more on the internal interdependence and the future of the Eurasian Economic Union. We then turn to Andrei Yohauro at the Center for European Transformation in Minsk, Belarus, who will put a spotlight on his country and make the connection with the Eurasian Economic Union. And then finally, our own CEPS's own Michael Emerson, who is Associate Senior Research Fellow at CEPS, but better known also in Moscow as the former head of the European Commission's delegation there in the early 90s. We'll talk more on external interdependencies and the prospects of engagement between the EU and the Eurasian Economic Union. If any of the panelists would like to raise questions to one another, I would invite them to do so after their short presentations. We've agreed amongst ourselves that we would attribute around 7 minutes to each of the opening remarks. As far as the participants in the audience are concerned, I would like to kindly ask them to use the chat function in the bottom ruler of your window, your Zoom window, in order to raise your questions, and I will do my utmost to collect as many interesting and pertinent questions that I will then field to our speakers. Final word on the logistical side is that this is being live streamed on YouTube and will be recorded as well. So this is an on-record show. Well, with that, Alexandra, I would like to invite you to present some of the findings of your report, which came out earlier this year, and in light, of course, of the changing political circumstances.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and good morning, colleagues, dear panelists, and dear audience. Yes, indeed, it's my big pleasure that we kick off this discussion on the Eurasian Economic Union today, even though the current events don't exactly inspire optimism. I will give you a very brief summary of the results of my 3-year process of monitoring the Eurasian Economic Union that involved interviews, dozens of interviews in all 5 member states of the Eurasian Economic Union, and also in Brussels, in the European External Action Service and the European Commission, DG Trade, because ultimately the main question is whether there are good prospects for engagement between the Eurasian Economic Union and the EU. Well, the publication is called Time to Let Down the Drawbridge. And as you can imagine, the main conclusion is that the EU's rejectionist stance towards the Eurasian Economic Union is untenable. And I found that it harms its own interests and the interests of the neighboring countries. So instead, technical dialogue between the EU and the Eurasian Economic Union is needed, and the existing one needs to be intensified and institutionalized. This is one of the main findings. It can revolve about harmonization of technical standards and have a long-term goal of a free trade zone, an asymmetrical free trade zone. Such agreement would consist of non-ideological matters, does not require a high-level partnership, and does not contradict sanctions that the EU has against Russia. The current wait-and-see approach may entail that other actors, and here I think first and foremost about China, that other tech actors may take the lead in the region. Think of regulatory rules. Perhaps the Chinese will be the ones who set those rules in the future if the EU doesn't take the lead to spread its all technical standards and trade norms in Eurasia. And if EU indeed prioritizes EU-Asia connectivity, if it wants to live up to its own promise of Weltpolitikfähigkeit, as Juncker once called it, or geopolitical commission of Ursula von der Leyen, if you will, and if the EU generally decides to take a more active stance in Eurasian neighborhood, it should naturally reach out to the Eurasian Economic Union. And in doing so, it's important to keep in mind that dialogue is not a reward for good behavior. We need it precisely when we have friction. And Eurasian Economic Union is not only about Russia. And here I think indeed about the neighborhoods, the common or contested Russia-EU neighborhood. And Stephen mentioned it already, it's pretty much on fire. And recent events in Belarus, and I very much look forward to the discussion on that, show to us that prosperity and peace in the common neighborhood between Russia and the EU is nothing to be taken for granted. So I'm very much aware that these arguments that I have been making just a few months ago fall on even more deaf ears today, that it seems that a new era has begun with the poisoning of Navalny, with even less signs from the Russian side that they're willing to cooperate, with very insecure prospects in almost all countries of the common neighborhood between Russia and the EU. But still, maybe precisely an economic dialogue is one of the few available tools to us where we can have some progress and explore in a fairly unpolitical way where can we actually cooperate and where can we build bridges. So this is just to kick off the discussion, the very basic tenets of what I had the chance to find through all those interviews and monitoring of the Eurasian Economic Union, and also stances at the EU side. And I very much look forward to the remarks of other panelists. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. I mean, you're of course right to point to the Navalny case, but that is only the latest expression, I suppose, in a long string of irritants which have been collected since, well, especially the August, the March 2014, actions in Ukraine, the illegal annexation of Crimea, and support for rebel groups in eastern Ukraine, etc., which has led the Foreign Affairs Council in March 2016 to outline 5 guiding principles underlying the EU's relations with Russia. 1, implementation of the Minsk Agreement as the key condition for any substantial change in the EU's stance towards Russia, having to do, of course, with the Donbass. 2nd, strengthened relations with the EU's eastern partners and other neighbors, including Central Asia, but the focus here in our discussion is, of course, on those eastern partners that belong to the Eurasian Economic Union, Belarus in particular. 3, strengthening the resilience of the EU, energy security, fight against hybrid threats, strategic communication, etc. 4, key, I think, in this context to which you relate, Alexandra, is selective engagement of the European Union with Russia on issues of interest to both, but primarily, of course, to the EU. It's after all the Foreign Affairs Council that set these principles. And 5, need to engage in people-to-people contacts and support for Russian civil society. These principles, these 5 principles, are still upheld by the European Union, implemented by the EU delegation primarily in Moscow, that is seeking, of course, ways to remain, talking about selective engagement and the approach. And the question here is whether indeed the Eurasian Economic Union could provide, the path of least resistance in a way so as to normalize relations in the short, mid, or to longer term. But before we go there, I think it is very interesting to hear from Tatiana more about the internal dynamics and interdependencies within the Eurasian Economic Union. I mean, the EU has just celebrated its 5th anniversary. As I alluded to in my opening remarks, that's probably too short for any regional organization of an economic nature to show its full potential. But we're still interested to hear from you how you would evaluate, the current situation of and solidity of the EEU. So, Tatiana, please.
Dear colleagues, thank you very much for inviting. It's my really big honor and pleasure. Sorry, a little bit for voice. It's my really honor and pleasure to be on the same panel with such distinguished speakers, and to share some ideas maybe with you, and maybe to infuse a little bit of optimism to our talk. Yes, everything is not really excellent in the relations, in the bilateral relations, if we take EU and EU, but at the same time, if we still discuss this issue, to my mind, it brings a little bit of optimism, because, not a problem is a main issue. The non-desire not to discuss the problem is the big trouble. So if we are still discussing it, it's good. Another thing, when I looked at my topic of I was supposed to contribute, I remembered the old story, just a few seconds to share with you, when the director, very famous, world famous personality, academician Arbatov, the director of the Institute of USA and Canada, when he was asked how he managed to remain the director of this research institute for many, many years, he answered that because I never tried to predict the United States presidential elections. So the best way to to be an expert on something is not to try to predict something. And talking about the Eurasian Union future is quite difficult. But we'll try maybe to cover some main issues. I have prepared some slides with ideas. I'm not sure that a very short time limit, it's useful to share them via screen sharing option, but later I could just download them, put them in a group and in the chat, and people maybe could look through. What I'd like to say that the main issue to my mind that the integration of Eurasian countries is undisputable fact. Countries should integrate. And we know that in the CIS history, let's take it broader. In the CIS history, there were a lot of attempts, and finally in 2008, 2009, please notice, pay special attention to this. In 2008, 2009, in the context of major geopolitical shifts and in a crisis, economic crisis situation, 3 countries managed to make a kind of breakthrough and create a bloc on the base of multilaterally accepted rules. And that time it was the base for hope and belief in the future of the bloc. However, in quite a short time, some contradictions and the political factors that you, Stephen, and Alexandra partially have already mentioned, the situation around Crimea, the situation in the east of Ukraine, and it all influenced the EU very significantly. I also wanted to quote, there is a wonderful researcher, unfortunately a strong opponent of the Eurasian Union, Katarina Volchuk. You all know her name. And Katarina, in 2017, in one of her research papers, she wrote that, just let me quote, that EAEU is failing to live up the grand narrative and fanfare that helped launch it. And it's unlikely to dissolve since it remains too important for Russia, but the future is undetermined. And instead of talking about figures, you know, it's bringing us to the question, what is internal dependence? There are some figures and there are some, I would say, qualitative features. And since in the last report under the patronage and guidance of Alexandra and her team. Am I right, Alexandra? And in many studies by Eurasian Commission, by High School of Economics in Moscow, by Eurasian Bank, there are a lot of figures indicating how mutual trade is increasing. So that's why I'd like to draw your attention, or maybe to be a little bit provocative and say that this interdependence we should understand as quantitative and qualitative. In terms of quantitative, yes, there is a certain increase of figures, and we all know them. Like, for example, Eurasian Commission argues that after 4 years, sorry, they fix it for the year 2019. After 4 years of existence of Eurasian Union, the mutual trade increased almost 1/3. For some positions, the situation is even better. For some positions, I mean the positions in the trade structure, the figures are more modest. And when I started to think what is preventing the deep integration in the Eurasian Union, it came to my mind that there are two main factors. There are some maybe not so much important factors, but there are two main of them. One is technological, and this is qualitative integration, or qualitative feature of integration. Technological, it means that the lack of technology in all Eurasian countries with an urgent need to sustain in the global competition, that is technological competition. And except for the case of Kyrgyzstan, unfortunately, there is a little evidence to suggest that integration within Eurasian Union is an optimal path towards modernization. All of us, we need technology, we need advanced technology, and mutually, unfortunately, we are not able to provide or to satisfy these urgent needs for each other. There were a lot of, again, in previous studies, there were a lot of recommendations how Eurasian countries should cope with this problem, what should be done, and we know them, and I have them on slides, but so far nothing helped, because the main driver for technological development is investment. And again, we're arriving to the situation, or coming to the situation that inside Eurasian Union, the possibility of mutual investment is quite limited. So where investment are supposed to come from Western partners, from developed countries, and the situation is, and the possibility is very, very limited. Another qualitative, that's to bring one figure to color a little bit our discussion. If we look at the share of engineering products in the mutual trade, it's about 25%, but in the last years, the increase was 0.5%. If we look at trade in food products, the share is 22%, but the growth is 6.6%. Let's take chemical products that are a part of the technological area. Chemical products, the share is more modest, 16%, and increases 1.5%. So if you see the increase of the technological goods in the mutual trade, unfortunately is very modest, and it means that we are still dependent on foreign market in terms of technological goods. And another qualitative factor that is definitely for Eurasian Union, it's exogenous, this is political factor. And political factor we also should understand from both sides. First one is there is a lack of political commitment and between Eurasian countries, between countries of the Eurasian Union, members of the Eurasian Union, and this political commitment creates or results in trade tensions. For some Eurasian countries, it seems that they are still seeking for some other options, and they still try to find a balance between Eurasian Union and other forms of cooperation with other countries, for example, Eastern Partnership for Armenia and Belarus. And sometimes it's good to find a balance, but sometimes it's impossible. And EU countries, Eurasian countries, they still have multi-vector foreign policy and foreign economic policy that doesn't allow them to concentrate on the Eurasian integration. Besides, there is a strong presence of non-regional actors. EU, this is partially regional, but not a part of Eurasian region in the meaning of Eurasian Union, United States and China. Alexander has already mentioned China. China is very famous for promoting its interest via soft power, via investment, while European Union, to my mind, for example, Eastern Partnership that was presented also as a soft power was not really very soft, in fact. And for example, comprehensive institution building program sometimes absolutely comes in contradiction with the interests of Russia as a designer of the Eurasian Union. Again, there is a choice for Belarus, Kyrgyzstan, etc., to choose what they prefer to integrate in. But at the same time, some principles are in contradiction. And the last but not the least, there is a US approach. The US approach is absolutely not supportive. And if you remember in 2012, at her last meeting as Secretary of State in the competence of Secretary of State, Ms. Clinton has described efforts to promote economic integration in Eurasia as a move to re-Sovietize the region. And she said that whatever you call that, customs union or Eurasian Union, it will never be accepted by United States, and it will be considered as a re-Sovietization and way back. And trying to make the conclusion of all of this, it came to my mind, at least I started to realize for myself, and maybe this is also the topic for discussion, that Eurasian integration bloc development cannot follow the way of traditional integration accomplishing the process by the political union. But in the Eurasian Union, sounds strange, but we need first to integrate politically, to establish political interdependence, and able to enhance economic integration and cooperation. Sorry if I took too much time. Thank you.
Thank you, Tatiana. It was perfectly fine and very clear points. I suppose many would take issue with your last proposition, but I just park it for the discussion for the moment. Whilst turning to Andrei to give us, the view from Minsk, both through the prism of current developments and longer term consequences in terms of Belarus's economic interdependencies. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Steven. It seems to me that I will be the most critical about Eurasian Union in this discussion, but let's see. The first couple of words about current situation in Belarus and the prospects of its economic development. At the very beginning of the political crisis in Belarus, I asked one of the best Belarusian economists, what does he think about the proposals of economic boycott as a tool of pressure on Lukashenko regime. These proposals included boycotting state-owned stores, withdrawing money from credit cards, withdrawing bank deposits, refusing to pay utility bills, and so on. And then he replied, okay, it's like shooting yourself in the leg, but from the different point of view, if this leg is still rotting, it might be better to cut it right now and then grow a new one. So this anecdote perfectly illustrates the ambivalence of ongoing situation and dependence of the political crisis and the economy in Belarus. The political crisis is a crisis of power legitimacy, but it has far-reaching negative consequences for the economy. In the short term, the situation leads to an increase in the risk of financial destabilization, as well as to deepening the economic recession and an increase in its duration. In the longer term, the political illegitimacy will lead to deterioration of the institutional environment and possible erosion of a human capital, with the risk of falling into long depression. The most visible consequences of the crisis now are households' withdrawal of funds from bank accounts and deposits, the increased demand for foreign currency as a result of growing devaluation and inflationary expectations of population, and this is the trend of August and September. National Bank somehow coped with the financial instability with its interventions, but this resulted in reduction of gold and foreign exchange reserves of the National Bank. And we see the departure of IT sector companies from Belarus. About 200 companies announced the relocation of its employees to the other jurisdictions. And as you know, the IT sector in Belarus is one of the fast-growing sector comparable to its contribution to GDP, to their agriculture. And as well, as a result of tensions with the international community, we see the reduction of possibilities to attract borrowings on international markets and loans from their international financial institutions. At the beginning of the year, Belarusian authorities expected to attract around 2.5 billion from international financial institutions, but now these opportunities are closed. But we need this money for economic recovery, taking in consideration coronavirus and oil shocks for the Belarusian economy. Before the political crisis, the most likely short-term scenario was a GDP decline of about 3% in 2020 and a slow recovery in 2021. But the political crisis led to a deepening and prolongation of the recession. According to our economists' estimations, by the end of 2020, the decline will deepen by at least 1 percentage point. So it will be about 4% of decline. And in 2021, if the problem of illegitimacy still persists, instead of weak recovery, the main scenario is a further deepening of the recession. The introduction of international sanctions against Belarus naturally deepen its dependency from Russia and Eurasian Economic Union. But Russian and Eurasian Economic Union willingness and possibilities to help declining Belarusian economy remains doubtful. Taking into consideration, for example, ambivalent Russian attempts to force Belarus for deepening political and economic integration. And at the very beginning of Eurasian Economic Union, I was very skeptical about its perspective, joking that this union is neither economic nor union. Later, it seems that at some level it works like a proper economic union, and Belarus could gain some economic benefits from Eurasian Economic Union in terms of credit attraction, access to the joint market, possibilities to use Eurasian Economic Union as an arena for lobbying of Russian oil and gas subsidies. Sometimes it was very successful story for Belarus. But their main problem of Eurasian Economic Union, from my point of view, is systemic and still persists. First is their contradicting interests of the countries. If Belarus, Armenia, Kazakhstan mainly interested in strengthening of their independence and then looking in the Eurasian Union tool how to maintain its sovereignty and to gain more independence. That's why, for example, they need in common energy markets because it strengthens the economic possibilities. But Russia used the economic union to maintain its economic and political dominance in the region that contradicts main interests of other countries. For example, Russia insisted on common budget and tax policy as the precondition for introduction of common energy market, which is probably not acceptable for such countries like Belarus and Armenia. As well, a huge disproportion between member countries' economies makes very difficult to reach the agreements on technical arrangements, like barriers, exemptions, and restrictions in the movements of goods. Regardless of adoption by the Eurasian Commission, the roadmap for removing restrictions and exemptions, their number is not decreasing but still growing. The same situation with the technical regulations and the standards. For example, Russian attempts to set up lower level of standards on milk or electric devices resulted in a fight with Belarus, which demanded more adequate standards. And in general, it seems to me that in contrast to their Kyrgyzstan, for example, Belarus is not looking in the Eurasian Economic Union the tool for modernization. It's looked like that European standards for Belarus is much closer to their own technical arrangement than the standards of their Eurasian Union. And the last but not least structural obstacle for development of the Eurasian Economic Union is their institutional imitation, let's say, like it put by our researcher Rosa Turarbekova. Eurasian Economic Union is trying to copy European Union institutions, but the real political and economic regimes in all the countries are far from liberal democracies and market economies. And these obstacles make hard to build free market union consisted from non-free economies. Objectively following its national interest, Belarus, even under the current regime, will seek for any opportunities to reduce its dependency from Russia and subsequently Russia's dominated Eurasian Union. It will use Eastern Partnership to build closer ties with the European Union and even try to exploit China's Belt and Road initiative to somehow strengthen its own independence and sovereignty. And if the democratic revolution wins, Belarus definitely will try to improve its relations with the European Union. But the existing dependency from Russia and its undoubtedly nervous reaction of any Belarus rapprochement with the West will lead to very slow and incremental process in this area. Belarus will definitely keep itself in the frameworks of the Eurasian Economic Union, but trying to find a new level of cooperation with the European Union. And the best scenario here could be the opening of negotiations of new EU-Belarus bilateral agreement similar to their comprehensive and enhanced partnership agreement like it was signed with Armenia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrei, also for sketching out those different scenarios as they may develop as a result of the current political pressures that are still building in Belarus. In fact, some of your remarks on both the political and the economic obstacles that you see resonate, I think, with what Michael is about to share with us. So Michael, you have the floor. Michael, please unmute yourself first.
You could do it instead of him. Just switch on his sound.
Better?
Yep. Go ahead.
Okay. So Tatiana, I was saying it's great to be virtually back in Russia, which I'm always in. From my days in Moscow, as representing the EU, I appreciated the huge potential scope for cooperation between the EU and Russia, especially at the people-to-people level, but also many other aspects. But now we come to a precise proposal here to enhance cooperation with the Eurasian Economic Union. I'll address this in its economic and political aspects. Both have to be, as it were, positive to give a green light to doing something. So first on the economics, the most important conceivable core real element there would be a free trade area between the European Union and the Eurasian Economic Union. And for the European Union, that would be very good. Very nice to have preferential access to the Russian market. The problems, the economic problems, are on the Russian side because Russia says, and I've been engaged in many conversations with Russians on precisely this point, well, the problem is all the advantages are on your side because your imports from Russia are already tariff-free. And more fundamentally, Russia today and tomorrow, in my view, is and will remain a deeply protectionist state with respect to the conditions for their industrial sector, which has the greatest difficulty to be competitive because Russia is a petro-dominated economy, which makes life very difficult for the non-petro sectors. Now, this is the fundamental reason why Russia is a deeply protectionist state, and we cannot anticipate that that would change, just to be realistic. So I would say Russia declines a free trade area, full stop, to be simple or basic. Now, are there alternatives? Well, the first alternative that the Eurasian Economic Union likes, which I've been into the Commission there and talked about it with them a little while ago, they would like to have a non-preferential agreement with the European Union, which the EU has with China. Well, what's the red meat going to be in that? What's it all about? I mean, on the Chinese side, it's easy for Putin and Xi to agree to mutually agreeable political gestures. But on the EU side, if there's no free trade area, what else is there in the competence of the Eurasian Economic Union? Well, actually, they do have serious competence in the technical standards business. But here there's a very interesting point. If you've bought a household appliance recently and look at their backside where all the technical stuff is, you see not only CE for European conformity, but also EAC for Eurasian Economic Union conformity, which means that in practice, the Eurasian Economic Union is using the same standards as the European Union. And the Eurasian Union actually has a memorandum of understanding with two principal European standards organizations, CEN and CENELEC, and is a full member, of course, of the ISO. So basically, it's being done already, and this runs on its own, and there's nothing really needed by way of a political agreement to do much more about it. Technical conversations actually do exist. I mean, the European Commission trade officials at quite senior level from time to time go into the Eurasian Economic Commission and talk about matters in an informal manner. Other alternative, which is hinted at in the note introducing this conference, is relations with other Eurasian Economic Union countries. And here, of course, there is the very pertinent point that both with Armenia and Kazakhstan, the EU has substantial cooperation agreements on matters of non-Eurasian competence, of course, which has to be excluded. And once the war hopefully in the Caucasus stops, that Armenia relationship could well be further deepened. So that's on the economics of it, which is not very encouraging for the Eurasian Economic Union, but still we have to discuss the politics of it. Russia here would like a broad-ranging cooperation agreement of a type that was under negotiation before things went bad over Ukraine. And there's a lot that could be done there, but the problem is there has to be political trust between the European Union and Russia in particular. And that trust today does not exist because of Russia's well-known episodes of coercive intervention in the near abroad, ongoing aggressive disinformation policies seeking to undermine democratic Europe, and what one might call, I'm afraid I have to say this, but look, we're here to talk about things with clarity, strategic dishonesty. I'm referring to the Skripal affair, to the Malaysian airline shot down, and now last but not least, the Navalny affair. Now, this leads straight into the most recent attempt at political engagement between Europe and Russia, for which Mr. President Macron is the best bet for the Kremlin. And they indeed, Putin and Macron had a conversation recently, during which it is sad to note that Putin said that Navalny may have poisoned himself. Now, this is telling us something, speaking volumes about the mindset and attitude of President Putin, which lead me to conclude that the options for a broad-ranging cooperation agreement, other than free trade with the EAU, it's all there, could be very interesting, but it looks like being for a post-Putin regime. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Your clarity is very much appreciated. Makes me realize, as we discussed it also yesterday, that the title of the event should perhaps not have been End of the Road, but well, how do we get to a road in the first place? In talking about EU Eurasian Economic Union relations, listening to well, most of you, in fact, there seems to be at least an acquiescence, if not consensus, that now is not the time, that the conditions have in fact worsened, and that there may be, well, in the Belarusian case, perhaps some economic drivers that could lead in one scenario with Lukashenko staying on to closer relations, but would be balanced out nonetheless with an invitation to seek more cooperation from China. Other than that, the Eastern Partnership countries that belong to the Eurasian Economic Union, Armenia as well, have, or Armenia in particular, at least with its SEPA agreement, has been able to straddle at least a fine line between the EU and the EU. And so one question which is posed in the chat box is, and I suppose we can ask Andrei this first and foremost, is whether in the scenario whereby the democratic opposition prevails in the current revolution, whether in the long run a SEPA type agreements between the EU and Belarus is the way forward.
Yeah, I think that Russia will tolerate this kind of agreement because it will take some time. It's not the very fast process. It should be the long talks with the European Union about the construction of the agreement, and as well, Belarus will have time to somehow to persuade Russia that its interest is guaranteed in Belarus. And of course, the existence of the same agreement with the Eurasian Union country like Armenia will be an argument for Belarus, just explaining why we need that kind of agreement. So I think Russians have no way than to accept that kind of agreement with the EU.
Tatiana, you wanted to make a comment about this as well.
Just there is no problem because Armenia managed to really to keep the agreement that was initially designed with European Union in the frame of Eastern Partnership, and then joined Eurasian Union. And there was quite a big surprise how Armenia will balance on this, but at the same, finally, the agreement does exist. This is, Andrei, probably you need to study it more in details. There is an agreement between Armenia and European Union, European Union in the frame of the Eastern Partnership. If we look at this agreement from business point of view, to tell you the truth, it's about nothing. But politically, it's a kind of a sign that, yes, we still accept you, we acknowledge you, we know you. But unfortunately, the mechanism of the free trade area or free trade zone, and even more customs union and economic union, this is technical issue. This is the question maybe to the WTO Article 24. But the mechanism doesn't allow countries to be into customs union at the same time. Sorry, it's not me, it's not Russia, it's not Russian power, it's just technical issue. So once and this was a case for Ukraine. The initial reason for the nightmare around Ukraine was that Ukraine was trying to keep free trade with European Union and with Russia. And it appeared to be impossible. And once at one conference, I tried to explain there is such a such a term, stolen tariff liberalization. So if there is a room later on, maybe I could explain what does it mean. But for Russia, the free trade zone with Ukraine EU meant the stolen tariff liberalization. So that's like.
Yeah, can I follow up with both of you on an adjacent point, which is raised by Tony van der Tocht in the Q&A box of Zoom. Tony is of course working for Klingendahl and associated to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the Netherlands. His question, I think, Andrei, first for you, is to the effects of further economic integration between Belarus and the Russian Federation under the Union state, and the effect of that on the Eurasian Economic Union and possible WTO membership prospects of Belarus.
Well, in comparison with the Eurasian Economic Union, the agreement on union state between Russia and Belarus put much more threats to the Belarusian sovereignty and independence than Eurasian Economic Union. So Belarus will probably follow the path of deeper integration in the frameworks of Eurasian Economic Union than deepening integration inside the Union state with Russia. And as we see now, even in the current situation, Lukashenko authorities and the Belarusian society are strictly opposing any attempts for deeper integration, especially political integration with Russia. And their institutional arrangements of the Eurasian Economic Union much more balanced with the possibilities to block some decisions or to have at least possibilities to fight for their interest, its interest, than in the frameworks of Union state.
Tatiana?
Thank you, Tony, for the question. I don't see you and I don't see your question, but it's nice to meet you again. Concerning Union state, you know, there is a different approach, a different perception. Probably it's personal between me and Andrei. Being an expert in economics and business, I'm looking at all documents from these. This is, you know, these professors, professional narrow specialization, and all documents, to my mind, we should evaluate first of all, or assess first of all from this economic point of view. From the economic point of view, the Union state document and for agreement, unfortunately, is nothing. It used to be, or it was designed again, probably by Russia. It was so many years ago. Yes, as a tool to strengthen or to keep Belarus very close to Russia. Yes, with the political control, we live in the real world. I don't want to say that Russia just an idealist country. Yes, this was an attempt, but currently it could be considered as a letter of intention, nothing more, because it became clear that Lukashenko is not going to give up his power. He was not going to share his power with Putin. Belarus would never be a part of big Russia. So I can't say anything concrete or important about this document. On your comment that Belarus would definitely like to decrease its dependence on Russia, it's very good intention. But in the Eurasian Union, Russia has 84%, if I'm not mistaken, 84% of GDP. So it's a little bit difficult for countries to decrease the dependence unless there is a significant increase of the GDP in other countries or something else.
Andrea, follow-up question still on this particular point raised to you also in the Q&A. I mean, how would Belarus, find different export markets for its industrial goods, its agri-food products?
Well, as I know, there are long talks with the European Union in the frameworks of Eastern Partnership about certification of our agricultural products and the possibilities to export them to European market, and even possibilities to export them to China through European market. And the main obstacles there are phytosanitary control and phytosanitary measures for Belarus. And like usual approach of Belarusian authorities, they looked some behind not usual way how to solve this issue, and the European Union insisted that first Belarus need to sign relevant protocols of WTO organization, then use the proper way how to enter European market. But what we can see here that there are possibilities how Belarusian goods and agricultural products could be certified and then go to the European market. And before a current political crisis, European Belarus Business Association discussed and there are some attempts to establish this association. This association as well could be probably in the future, after the resolution of the political crisis, like an organization to help Belarusian businesses to enter European market.
Michael, is this something you would like to comment on? Yes, I thought so. Please unmute yourself. Unmute.
Yes, on the question as to what Belarus could do to diversify its external economic relations. Well, step number one is to join the WTO, which would give stable trading relations with the rest of the world and would give comfort to those Belarus industrial enterprises that have potential in global markets. Actually, a little while ago, I had the pleasure of visiting the Belaruski Automobil Zavod, which make these huge, biggest in the world, dump trucks, selling them mainly still to the CIS markets. But the management there persuaded me very plausibly that they are extremely competitive, potentially in Brazilian, Australian, and other markets requiring such equipment. And in the IT sector also, Belarus is very competitive. So there could be a soft, practical approach to this, which wouldn't upset anybody, including the Kremlin. Going one step further, I'm replying now to one of the questions in the written questions and answer session as to whether Belarus could make a SIPA type agreement. SIPA is the code word for the EU-Armenian relationship, which envisages extensive cooperation and quite practical stuff, other than issues such as tariffs, which are competence. A cooperative, politically cooperative, wider European framework, something like that is conceivable.
Michael, a follow-up question perhaps to you, and I'm also segueing to Alexandra, but the other speakers, of course, should be free to come in as well. on Tatiana's point, FTA is basically impossible between the Eurasian Economic Union and the EU. You also discussed in your opening remarks the difficulties for an FTA between the EU and Russia. Is there, however, at inter-bloc level, EU, Eurasian Economic Union, as Pierre Mirel asks in the Q&A, a possibility for more limited agreements? Either of you. Tatiana, do you see a scope for more limited agreements than an FTA?
Yeah, you know, I'm not saying that it's absolutely impossible. Just the understanding of the scope of the FTA is a little bit now different. And as I made in my comment that there was a time when the FTA was discussed, but it was a kind of Russian proposal. Russia proposed FTA, and that time the European Union was not ready to sign this agreement. Time passed, and now Russian market is, you know, Russian market in terms of goods, it's quite open. Again, upon the WTO accession, a lot of limitations were just eliminated and customs duties were decreased significantly. But now from the Russian point of view, if we're talking about national interests, probably a wider coverage may be included. And we know that from the world experience, we know that current FTAs, they are not about trade. They are about everything. They include services exchange, services trade, they include intellectual property, they include investment. So for Russia, probably the investment issue might be of greater interest than just simple trade exchange, trade turnover. That's, and I understand that's quite risky for European Union, and they are not ready. So if we consider the lower format, let's say, or maybe not as institutionalized as FTA. And it's, Michael, probably you will support me in this. It was discussed at several meetings. Maybe we could sign the agreements on separate issues of bilateral cooperation. Like, for example, technical standards is a great topic for the agreement. Sectoral, it could be sectoral agreement. Sectoral, it means that it's not FTA or general type agreement, but it's sectoral in terms that it covers closer cooperation, but in one sector. Being a representative of academia, I am really very much interested in students' mobility, in academic exchange, academic cooperation. So probably there could be a special agreement deepening the cooperation in this field, in this area. You know, there is, if you can't reach something by one step, try to do it in small steps. And it will contribute to the Eurasian development, European development, and probably interests of all partners in the Eurasian Union will be taken in consideration.
Michael, a question to you. I mean, you mentioned in your opening remarks that the technical standards are in fact already being applied. Is there any political or symbolic importance to be attached to an ACA, an agreement on conformity and equivalence in sectors that Tatiana is referring to? Unmute. Unmute. Michael, you have to unmute yourself.
Okay. First, to respond to Tatiana's specific point on technical standards. Basically, as I mentioned earlier, basically it's being done unilaterally on the side of the Eurasian Economic Union with technical cooperation with the European and international agencies. So there's no need to politicize this. It's really a remarkably positive status quo, full stop. Other question in the written questions as to whether it's possible to make not an FTA, a free trade agreement, the general one, but product-specific agreement. Well, here you have to be very careful. At the level of tariffs, the answer is absolutely not, because the relationship is a WTO relationship, and so the bound tariff schedules of the EU and the Eurasian Economic Union are the game, and you can't monkey around with just individual items there. It's the whole thing. Of course, tariffs are not everything, and all sorts of investment agreements can be made on a private sector basis.
Thank you, Alexandra. I apologize for not having turned to you earlier.
No worries. I'll just try to jump in and comment on a few things that have been just said, and especially referring to what Michael and Tatiana just said in terms of a lower profile agreement than an FTA. And I think this refers to your question, Stephen, that you posed in the very beginning, whether engagement with the Eurasian Economic Union is the kind of path of least resistance if we were to think of selective engagement. Well, first of all, I would like to mention that an FTA is not impossible. And as far as I understand it, an FTA between the EU and the Eurasian Economic Union as such. We have heard good reasons, and I very much agree with what Michael said, why perhaps Russia is not quite interested because of a protectionist nature of its policy in the industrial sector. However, it's, I think, worthwhile mentioning that there are possibilities which would be below a full FTA and perhaps bigger than a non-preferential agreement, for which perhaps the EU has no reason to sign. It would be an asymmetrical FTA. So I think this could perhaps try to square the circle by allowing Russian goods on the EU market and to flow freely, and EU goods flowing on the Russian market a bit later, kind of phased off, like it is the case, if I'm not mistaken, in the DCFTA between Ukraine and the EU. So it's a kind of phased opening of the market, so that the Russian side, for example, could be its worry that the competitive EU goods would flood the Russian market and pose a problem in terms of competitiveness. This could be a bit traded off. Also, Michael mentioned that the technical dialogue is already going on, but it wouldn't cost much, I would think, to institutionalize it by, as Tatiana was suggesting, signing some kind of agreement. It does not cost much in economic terms. It would be a sign of goodwill. It would be a sign of the first small step. It wouldn't change much of the reality on the ground. And it's very much true that many Eurasian Economic Union standards are indeed already on the level of the EU ones. But why not formalize it, especially sending a signal towards China that the EU, together with its partners further east, would like to establish a regulatory, well, dominance or monopoly, if you will, on the Eurasian market. And perhaps one more point, if you allow, on indeed a very controversial thing perhaps that Tatiana said, that we first need to integrate politically and only then an economic integration could proceed. Funny enough, I was reminded of the EU, which, as some of you mentioned, well, is serving as a blueprint for the Eurasian Economic Union. Indeed, in many ways it does. But funny enough that the EU faces exactly the same problem. Because of the lack of the political integration, we are facing difficulties in the economic realm. EU is a separate point. I know we're not going to discuss the luxury problems of EU integration right now. We deal with the Eurasian Economic Union. And here I would just like to draw your attention to the fact that not only market democracies have prospects to integrate successfully. If we look at Association of Southeastern Nations, ASEAN, these are by no means only democratic countries, which are very successful at a regional trade bloc. And here, theories of trade integration help us a little bit to understand the differences. While some countries, like advanced market economies in the EU, integrate with each other, have a trade bloc or an economic union for using the benefits of trade between each other and using the scale of a bigger market, least advanced countries use or connect economically for having a better position on a world market, for having a union that would give them benefits to trade with the rest of the world. So it's a different kind of integration logic, not the internal one. And indeed, there are not so many internal advantages or like potential that EU countries could exploit while integrating deeper. We heard this from Tatiana. But to have a better position on the world stage, little countries that have little potential like Armenia or Kyrgyzstan, they integrate together with bigger partners to have a better standing on international market. So I just throw these points out at you and hope that some of you maybe agree or disagree, and would like to hear the opinion of other panelists. Thank you.
You're preempting part of the discussion, because we've heard quite a bit of dissonance on the blue sky thinking that you propose. For example, on an asymmetric FTA, perhaps less so on the institutionalization of a technical standards dialogue. But in fact, I would like to move the discussion also a little bit. I mean, you've thrown up a lot of dust, and I'm sure that the speakers will want to come in on some of those points. I would like to pitch two other ones of a structural nature, both within the Eurasian Economic Union and on the EU side, and the role of Germany there. On the Eurasian Economic Union, the EU has, of course, long attempted at interregional cooperations through FTAs with, South American or Central American states, for example, negotiations with ASEAN, etc. But as a community of law, it also looks, of course, at the adherence to the law, the enforcement mechanisms, the supranational character, which also Eurasian Economic Union law is supposed to have on that of the national law of the member states of that union, and sees that for the moment, at least, supranational precedent is not followed or is not enforced through courts of law in a way, but is politically motivated. So to what extent does the core of the Eurasian Economic Union's community of law and its unfinished business there hamper any form of EU Eurasian Economic Union cooperation through legal agreements? That's the first question. And I throw it out there for any of you to respond. The second question, I think, is a bit more for colleagues from FES. And it's on Germany, which of course is the most populous and economically powerful, politically powerful state in the European Union, still has seen, as Fyodor Lukyanov, research director of the Valdai International Discussion Club, wrote in your magazine, International Politics and Society, of last week, that Ostpolitik from Willy Brandt and those of his successors has generally phased out in a way, to the extent that recent developments, culminating with the chemical attack against Navalny, have in fact eroded or changed Germany's position vis-a-vis Russia, it seems, not hampering the Nord Stream 2, natural gas interdependence as of yet as a stabilizing factor in European security writ large, but nevertheless, it seemed to have, produced a shift of Germany's stance in this, in the more general relations with Russia. My question here is how you appreciate the alleged interdependence on natural gas for security and stability of Europe and the future of EU-Russia relations, and whether you think indeed that Lukyanov is right, that Germany and Russia are drifting apart as a result of the many irritants they have collected along the way, and where potentially with the political horizon of Angela Merkel as Chancellor of Germany coming closer, we might see a rupture in ultimately the EU's position vis-a-vis Russia, with a knock-on effect perhaps on the Eurasian Economic Union. Two different questions, of course, and again, I would invite anyone to come in on those points. Alexander.
Yeah, I would just like to comment on the last question in terms of German-Russian relationship and Lukyanov's take. I had the chance to speak just recently exactly on these topics with some people from the German MFA, and we discussed that probably the current cooling off is more of a tactical nature. We know it seemed to be a big bang the moment when the German diplomacy, German politics for the first time connected foreign policy with economy by mentioning that Nord Stream might be canceled, right? But in the long term, in the strategic kind of vision, it's much more likely that Germany will keep on remaining its middle ground, kind of being not exactly Russia's friend perhaps, but still being open for dialogue and seeing perhaps the economic cooperation as one of the avenues for such dialogue. Certainly German patience runs thin, and there are certain landmarks or milestones to reach, and one of them coming up fairly soon will be the trial or the result of the trial in the Tiergarten murder, which certainly soured the relations a lot. The Navalny poisoning comes on top of that. Germany is kind of still waiting for a constructive Russian reaction, even though it might be hard to say how long they are supposed to wait. But as for gas dependence, I think it runs both ways. And I don't expect, since we haven't seen steps towards cancellation of Nord Stream so far, I don't expect Germany to politicize it further. Russia has been a reliable trader, or how do you say, sold gas to Germany quite reliably, and it covers supplier, thank you, and it covers a certain share of the German gas, and Germany indeed sees it as part of the diversification strategy, different pipelines, different suppliers. So yeah, to give an answer, I don't quite share the view of some of the expert community that we have a big watershed. Patience is running thin, but I don't expect a big change, at least in the near future.
Thank you, Tatiana.
Yeah, you raised quite difficult questions. On the first one, if I still remember it correctly, to my mind, if you look at the Eurasian institutional base, just if we examine laws and then the agreements published on the Eurasian Commission website, it looks absolutely perfectly. It looks just extremely wonderful. Everything is taken into consideration. Everything is fixed by the internal documents. The problem is that in the theory of integration that Alexander has already referred to, we distinguish the institutional integration and the real integration. And this is a case of the proper institutional, when you have everything done, everything signed, everything taken into, put on paper, but at the same time, few documents really work. Why? It's quite costly. The harmonization inside the bloc is a time-consuming issue, is a budget consuming issue, and that's why, to my mind, probably this is one of the reasons why it goes so slowly. But nothing in the Eurasian law prevents from signing the agreements, and few agreements have been signed from the Eurasian Union part, free trade agreements. So nothing is preventing to sign the agreement, any kind of agreement with European Union. On the second question, it's really great.
Just to interrupt and to connect that to Sergei Chernychev's question.
Yeah.
Is also the reason, while indeed the lack of disciplines basically on on market operators, but ultimately also on regulators across the common market that will hamper further investment into each other's markets, or indeed facilitate FDI from outside?
If I understand the question correctly, if it's to me, I would suggest that, or I would argue that the common legislation, it's easy or more convenient for a foreign investor to deal with. When you have the legislation on different countries and go into this area of the world, in terms of business, you need to study, let's say, 5 legislational base. When you have one legislation for big market with a free movement of goods, services, investment inside, it's more profitable, or it's more in the interest of foreign investors. So to my mind, the EAEU common disciplines, once they work, that's what I'd like to stress or put in red color, once they work, they will contribute to transparency and they will be more interesting for investors. Sergey, I don't know if I answered your...
I think that answers that question, yeah. Andrei, can I turn to you? Perhaps, I mean, in view of the time, also invite you to share some closing remarks.
Well, first of all, I want to make a couple of statements about their possibility, how their supranational legislation could influence, or is it possible to be for supranational legislation of Eurasian Economic Union to be binding for Russia, for example? I think that it's no way for that kind of arrangement in the current political and economic situation. And again, this is because for me, in principle, I can hardly imagine the legally binding arrangement on the level of Eurasian Economic Union if we don't have proper implementation of the rule of law principles in our countries. And this could create rather interesting situation that in terms of Eurasian Union, there are possibilities to enter Eurasian Union market. But in concrete examples, then the companies enter, for example, Belarusian market, they face very specific local regulations and very specific policies in Belarus about foreign companies entering the market and specific spheres in Belarusian market. And that's create, you know, very interesting situation. Then we have declarations about real free market and movements of goods and companies, but very sometimes limited possibilities for real companies to enter markets in their specific countries. That's why I still don't believe that illiberal democracies with non-free market economies could build a real economic union based on the free market principles.
Thank you. Michael, do you wish to offer some concluding remarks from your side?
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I just respond to Alexandra's last remarks in favor of what she calls an asymmetric free trade agreement and institutionalization of work on technical standards. By asymmetric, I guess, Andrei, you would have in mind, and I certainly have in mind, the kind of norm which would be EU scraps tariffs on day one, 100%, and the partner, let's say Russia, scraps tariffs in 5 equal steps, 5 annual equal steps, something like that. So a negotiation starting from that is the most plausible route or hypothesis. But the question would be whether Russia would be serious about that, and a reliable partner in terms of its trade policies, which up until now it is not. It plays around with everything, irrespective of WTO rules, particularly with countries in the near abroad. On the institutionalization of the technical standards business, well, that's easy to do, yes, but I would still make that conditional on the political aspects that I mentioned and are well understood. The problem here is that this institutionalization of technical standards in the EU is very small fish indeed compared to these huge political issues.
Thank you, Michael. Pierre, I'm handing it back over to you for the closing, but perhaps you would also like to still touch upon Germany's own position.
Yeah, many thanks. I think I would strike another tone than Alexandra did. Obviously, Germany will always be a promoter of better relations with Russia. I think this is untouched. And also, Russia will always look to Germany as the largest country in the European Union to make the main kind of advantages to the European Union. But I think what changed, and that shows the Lukyanov paper, and it's something I hear quite often from German politicians, it's this relation is a little bit relieved, let's say, from any kind of romanticism about possible cooperation. And there's a lot of disillusionment on both sides, which maybe is in the long run even, or let's say midterm, even a better situation, because we don't expect to share the same perspectives any longer on a couple of more value-based issues, which leaves open to the view for the more interest-based things like economic trade and so on, because both sides are still interested in keeping any kind of working relation. No one is interested in escalating the situation further. So let's kind of, get rid of romantic ideas about a shared realm between Vladivostok and Lisbon in the value field, maybe makes it easier on a later term to come to terms interest-driven on economic cooperation and so on, and to focus very narrowly on these islands of cooperation we are facing. So I think there is a little shift, which maybe makes it even better or easier now to deal with a difficult relationship.
Okay, well, thank you very much for those closing remarks. I would like to thank all of you panelists for presenting not only the study, Alexandra, that you've been wishing to do a roadshow with, turned virtual in the end. Thank you very much for your comments, and of course to Tatiana in Moscow, to Andrei in Minsk, and to Michael in Brussels for joining us in this rich conversation. I'm sure we could have this conversation again in 2-3 years' time, slightly more frustrated, I suppose, by going by some of your interventions today. Pierre, thank you very much for facilitating this event, and to all participants for joining, for raising their questions. We have entertained most of those that were typed into the Q&A chat box. Apologies to those that we didn't get around to, but feel free to communicate bilaterally with any of our speakers also Tatiana, maybe to share your slides after this, this event. With that, I'm closing it, and thank you very much. Have a nice remainder of the day.
Thank you.